Exactly. So I'm here today to kind of talk to you about the other side of the coin of what John just spoke about. And I think that's actually kind of appropriate. I am not a native Mandarin speaker, but I have been told that the Chinese use the same character for challenge and opportunity when they're writing it out. And I think what John laid out is that there have been developments in transportation over the last 40 years, if not more, and now we have the opportunity to apply technology in new ways to those problems. And I think potentially with on-demand is a great way to kind of think about that. So my goal here today with you is to kind of give a little bit of a microtransit 101, explain what it is, and also talk to you about who VIA is and how we're involved with microtransit and how we think about kind of designing on-demand systems. And then I'll kind of hopefully end by running you through a couple case studies and kind of experiences from the field from our other partnerships and deployments. So I should have done this at the beginning before all the random trivia, but my name is Gardiner, and I lead VIA's partnerships for the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast. And I'm joined here today with my teammates, Dave and Madeline, and we're very excited to sponsor this. And Kevin, thank you very much for inviting us. So quick show of hands, how many people have been in this situation? It's a maybe 50-minute walk, it's a $25 Uber, or you have to wait maybe 60 to 90 minutes for a bus to get from A to B. And you're kind of stuck in, you'd like to take public transit, but you can't. How many people have been in that situation? All right, so there's a way that technology enablement of being able to call a vehicle is now available to be merged with public transit that allows us to address that. And usually the way that the industry has kind of come to talk about this is the word microtransit or on-demand transit. And it's intended to fill a gap. So at its base, microtransit is a technology-enabled form of shared transportation. So it makes use of dynamic dispatch and routing. So basically three things. Assuming you can do this with the technology you have, it identifies people that are generally traveling in the same direction, and then it intelligently pools those people in the same vehicle for that shared trip, and then it also directs both the driver and the rider to what we call a virtual bus stop for pickup and drop off. And what that feels like in practice for a rider is, traditionally we've always thought about, John was talking about hailing with your hand. This is basically the technology-enabled version of that, and we've only kind of applied that to traditional demand response like paratransit or where you want to pre-book in the recent past. But we can do that now in kind of an on-demand setting where you can expect to get a vehicle in maybe like 5 to 20 minutes, depending on kind of your fleet size and the area that you might be serving. So if I'm a rider and I'm in that situation that I described at the beginning, I can pull out an app on my phone and basically indicate this is where I am right now, this is my origin, and this is where I'd like to go, this is my destination. And the app will kind of look at all the other people that are traveling that same direction and the available vehicles to give you that trip and suggest a trip for you. And they'll give back to you a location, a wait time, and a fare. And then you as the passenger might need to walk 2 to 3 minutes, several hundred feet, maybe max like 100 yards to a pickup place. That's determined by the app and will tell you to go there. You'll meet your driver, and then when you get in, there might be someone that is already on an existing trip, where you might detour slightly to pick up someone and then drop them off at a location, and they'll walk 100 feet to their destination. And then you can follow that vehicle in real time by looking at the phone. There's real-time vehicle tracking, and then after the trip, you can leave real-time feedback in terms of starring the trip, the experience, as well as the driver. So a couple of questions that often come up from public transit riders when this is a mode that's introduced into the public transit realm. How many people am I going to share a ride with? It really depends. Hopefully, if it's most efficient, because in this setting you can deliver the most people from A to B with the least vehicle miles traveled, you could be sharing a vehicle with up to 4 to 6 people. In off-peak times, it may be less than that, but on average, hopefully it's somewhere around 3 or 4. how long does it take to get a ride when you say, okay, here's my origin, here's my destination? Usually, in standard industry practice for true on-demand, like in the moment, is something 20 minutes or less. And that has implications for how you go about designing the area that you want to serve with on-demand and the number of vehicles, the fleet size that you want to have serving within that. Can I bring my friends and family if it's just me with the app? Definitely. So you would do that by indicating I have 2 or 3 passengers that are coming with me, and that would be taken into account by the algorithm to kind of to make that amount of space, if it's available, going in a direction of other people, to make use of that for your group. And then, also questions of accessibility. If I'm in a wheelchair, or if I'm otherwise mobility impaired, if I don't have standard vision, will I be able to use the service? As long as the app is kind of WCAG 2.0 certified, then it will be accessible to that group, as well as long as there's a wheelchair accessible vehicle within the fleet that's serving that kind of on-demand zone. And then the max that you would walk, again, is probably, in an ideally designed service, around 2 to 3 minutes. So maybe like max 2 football yards, or 2 football fields that you might walk to your pickup or drop-off point, which is pretty standard practice, because unless you're kind of within an eighth of a mile walking, max a quarter mile of a public bus stop or a fixed line, you're not going to think of it as necessarily really accessible to you. And like any other public mode, microtransit has to be accessible. So as I mentioned before, including the right mix of wheelchair accessible vehicles, which in the model, it's important to note, won't be serving corner to corner where you have to walk to the pickup and walk from the drop-off, but would actually be configured automatically by virtue of you putting your profile as someone that's mobility impaired as a door-to-door ride. And that's standard for paratransit and some non-emergency medical travel. But what's interesting is you talk to the disability advocates, their ideal form of paratransit is sometimes microtransit if it exists. And so in some cases, for operators that have chosen to embrace microtransit, they've actually seen paratransit riders make up as much as 7% of their microtransit trips in that area, instead of using it on the traditional demand response system. And while technology is good, and we'll get to the metaverse, maybe, I actually hope not, but that's a side story. You have to be able to accommodate all different types of riders. And so this includes being able to actually call in and book an on-demand ride as well if you're a non-smartphone user. So in that case, you would be given an SMS text, or even indications on the phone. Your driver will be there at this location, which is a couple blocks away, in 10 minutes. So phone booking is incredibly important for this type of mode to work. And lastly, the many unbanked riders, especially those that are trying to make use of public transit to get from A to B. So while it's great to be able to have kind of fare integrations where you could have standard transit cards that you're maybe drawing down on, or if you want to put your credit card in to pay like you might do with kind of ride hailing like you do in Uber and Lyft, it won't matter for those that are unbanked. So they have to be able to pay by cash on board. So given the kind of flexible nature of microtransit service provision, it's really great for a few different use cases. And you see these kind of in the kind of shadow of where the fixed route is already working really well on high capacity corridors. So that includes transit deserts, places where people would like to use public transit within their community, but they can't get from A to B currently with how the system is designed. It also works with converting, even kind of for certain parts of the day or wholesale, certain fixed routes that might be underperforming in terms of utilization, so like riders per vehicle hour. In rural settings, where you have that kind of constant trade-off between coverage versus frequency, in some cases the only way to kind of get that coverage is to embrace a more dynamic model. And this includes more exurban and kind of various stages of suburban settings where you're more sparsely populated. You want to provide coverage, and you can give a 10-minute ETA to someone in an area that may not be served by a high-frequency fixed route bus by embracing the kind of microtransit model. And then also in certain cases, not only for getting to downtown employment locations, but also to new greenfield and brownfield developments like Amazon warehouses and new employment nodes and centers that, because of the pace of the economy and change in the workforce, just weren't taken into account when the original fixed route was designed in terms of where it was serving. Ultimately, what this kind of model allows you to do is to blanket an area with virtual bus stops so that everyone has kind of immediate accessibility to a efficient as well as sustainable mode of public transit. And they're a few blocks from a public transit stop, wherever they live or work in the area. And it can have pretty measurable and immediate impacts. So as an example from Hall County, Georgia, it's a county of about 400 square miles, but it's kind of centered around the city of Gainesville, which is 40,000 population. They had 3 kind of underperforming fixed routes that they converted into an on-demand network. And within 2 months of doing that conversion, they were able to take their cost per trip down by about half, and their wait time went from about 45 minutes down to 12 minutes, all while getting 20% more ridership in the process. So especially in these kind of these specific use cases we just saw, it can be a really powerful tool for public transit. So let me just back up a second and kind of explain to you why is this guy talking to me about microtransit. I work with a company called VIA, and we are a company that creates technology to power public mobility. And we're essentially building a digital platform for everything that moves within a community. And that includes everything from transit planning and consulting and street design to operating software, like what I just described to you, to enable on-demand microtransit, but also ADA compliant paratransit and non-emergency medical travel. We also work with dynamic routing and student tracking in the school bus setting, as well as university shuttles and safe ride programs. And we're integrating all that with the local and regional transit infrastructure. And the idea is to create a virtuous loop by virtue of the platform that allows you to not only kind of imagine and look at and plan out how you'd like your community to move, but then the operational tools for a dispatcher or a driver or a rider to be able to use those in that new plan, and then ultimately all the data from that service be fed back into the planning environment to be able to continue to optimize it. Because if there's one thing we know is that you need something more flexible because there are rapid changes happening in the world, and that affects how people move within it. And so the flexibility to address that is kind of very important. So VIA is a company that has over 500 partnerships globally. We've delivered 100 million rides to date, and across all our partnerships, our software is enabling 2.5 million shared rides. It just wasn't a mode that was kind of embraced then, so we had to build it ourselves and prove that there was actual demand for it. So once we did that, we built a software capability for dynamic dispatch and routing, and that's what we now partner with municipal entities as well as agencies around the globe. And each one of these points is different, which is kind of important because our algorithm, you can make small tweaks to it for how you actually move people around. But two of the hardest things to model in the world are water and people moving in vehicles. And every bit of data that you can collect on that, anonymized, is to how these people move within certain geographic densities for certain use cases. It brings value into each new kind of partnership that we have. And we work primarily as a technology enabler. So we provide a rider app, a driver app, and an operations console for kind of an administrator or dispatcher view, a driver view, and for the rider to be able to actually book the rides. And we also provide a planning environment through our Remix software to be able to plan the actual design of the system. And so I'll kind of break here, and what I wanted to do today is kind of walk you through, if you were interested in on-demand or thought that it was something that you wanted to be able to bring to your own transit network, how would you go about designing it? What's kind of like best practices around it? So right off the bat, there's kind of 4 things that are very critical to any kind of successful microtransit service. One is having a dedicated fleet. So this is frankly why Uber and Lyft don't always work, because it's completely subject to the whim of whether someone wants to sign on and drive them. And they're incentivized per trip. It works much better if a municipality or an agency is equipped with that software that they can offer on-demand, kind of white-labeled in the local transit plan, building the community, and have a dedicated fleet and drivers that are assigned to delivering those on-demand trips. It also doesn't work unless it's part and parcel of the fixed route regional system. It really doesn't, it can't operate in a vacuum. And you're never gonna displace the need for fixed route running on high capacity corridors in terms of cost per trip. Where this can be really powerful is as a supplement to that, especially as you reimagine different public transit systems. And that's where it's really important to integrate into that, so you can maybe even see an intermodal trip, like a multi-leg proposal where you take microtransit to a fixed route to ultimately get to your destination. It has to be accessible to everyone, because not only because it's just, but to work well and get ridership, it has to be accessible and meet those criteria. And then also, it needs to be kind of quickly and flexibly designed and launched. And one of your quotes, Kendra, was you need to just go out and do it. Oftentimes, the best way to get started with these is to start small and then to grow it using the data that you can see in terms of how to expand the service. It could be an additional zone, it could be changing the zone or modifying service hours. It could be adding a use case. It could be bringing a partner in, like a university, to add student transportation to it. It's a whole bevy of things, but kind of getting on the map and introducing it and starting is often the best way. So if you're going to kind of start from zero, and you said, hey, let's design a microtransit service in 10 minutes. These are the 5 steps that you kind of go through. First, you gotta establish, and it's very important to back out from this, you gotta know what your goals are, and then you need to draw the zone, design it, simulate certain scenarios within it to understand if it's gonna serve the kind of use case you want, and then launch and optimize. So when I say goals, there are kind of entities that I will call kind of like innovation anxious, and a lot of autonomous vehicle providers are in this, where they have a pilot, but it's kind of a dog and pony show. It's not really integrated into the regional transit picture. It's not having a tangible impact. Whatever on-demand's applied to, it works best when it's actually tied to an end goal. Is it that you have poor utilization and you're trying to decrease your cost per trip? Is it that you have a transit desert that you otherwise just cannot serve except through a more flexible transit means? Is it that you want to expand the coverage area that you're serving, or just grow ridership in general? It could be that you want to decrease congestion due to other kind of single occupancy vehicle ride sharing, or just people choosing their SOV or over other modes. It could be that you want to reduce wait times. Whatever the goal is, you have to kind of establish a top 3 and then say, this is what I want to, this is the impact that I eventually want to measure for when I implement an on-demand system. And then you have to draw the zone and design the service. So drawing the zone is kind of as simple as looking geographically on a map, knowing what kind of goals and use case you want, and establishing an area around which, if I was a rider in it and I was equipped with a rider app, I'd be able to book a ride. There are low-tech ways and high-tech ways of doing this. We like to use our Remix planning software to do this, and then ideally, you then kind of use expected demand that you'd see within that area, and you kind of match that in a bit of like a 3-legged stool with, all service design planning is demand, supply and quality of service. You can change, two of those, but it's going to have an impact on the other. And so, as an example, it's kind of like a physics problem. If you've got an area that's 10 square miles, you can serve X amount of trips with 4 vehicles. If you had an area that was 250 square miles, and you only had 10 vehicles, you're not going to be able to do as many trips because you're not going to be able to aggregate them. And so this is where having a technology partner really helps, because they can actually run simulations for you. So that means looking at supply-wise, how many vehicles do you have? How many seats are generally available? During COVID, we had to do something a little more flexible and restrict capacity within the vehicles to half. Can you do that kind of on the fly? What are the operating hours? And then you match that against, in an ideal world, what's the experience like for your rider? Do you want them to wait 5 minutes? Do you want them to wait 20 minutes? Are there instances that you run a service, but maybe 5% of the riders don't end up getting a proposal because there's just not the fleet size? It could be a trade-off that you're willing to make to at least have some minimum amount of coverage in an area that otherwise would have none. And then also stuff like detour. So if I get in and I'm on a ride, like how willing am I to detour 20 minutes versus 40 minutes? Those are all things that we now have data on, because microtransit has kind of been taken up as a globally accepted kind of mode within public transit, and something you can kind of run simulations against. And so you kind of engage in this service design exercise, and you simulate with certain parameters, and you alter those, you tweak them, you rerun it, and you rely on, this is the area that I'd like to serve, this is the number of vehicles I have, and this is how many rides per day, per week I think we could do having an on-demand service, and this is the impact we could make. So all a little bit theoretical, but hopefully useful in terms of kind of conceptualizing what is on-demand other than kind of like Uber or Lyft and it's ride-hailing. That's how you think about kind of going from theoretical to the practical in terms of implementing it. And I want to kind of end here by running you through a couple, I think, really illustrative partner case studies from places where VIA has had the opportunity to partner with either agencies or cities. And these first 3 examples, I think, are just really drive home the fact that flexible modes of transit have to be nested within and supplement the fixed route network. So in King County Metro in Seattle, VIA runs a purely first, last, and mile service called Via to Transit. It was King County's Metro wanted to brand it that way. Usually we would suggest, UTN or Smart Detroit. And the only trips that are available are to and from, so it has to begin or end with light rail stations. So there's four regions that are south of Seattle that a light rail system runs through. Very hilly terrain, difficult for people to walk up and down. There was issues with people getting there 2 hours ahead of time to get a spot at a park and ride lot. And King County Metro implemented this to basically fill that first last mile gap. And it's 27 vehicles that are kind of allocated based on both historical but also demand to those 4 zones. And we're actually getting up near around 14 passengers per vehicle hour during peak commuting hour on that service. Another example is Utah Transit Authority. So they had a fixed route system that they knew was well functioning, but they wanted to connect people more to it, as well as offer kind of what they called community trips. So rides within areas that weren't currently served by fixed route. So they started several zones that are all kind of offering first last mile trips to UTA fixed route, and about half of the trips that are on the service connect to the fixed route. The other half are within areas that otherwise didn't have public transit before that, and it's kind of fully integrated with the Fair Pay card. And then the last example is from SMART in Detroit, which is kind of the regional Detroit Transit Authority. As you can see there, they wanted actually to have a world where if a rider went from A to B, they would be given multiple proposals. If it made most sense for them to take a fixed route, they get a fixed route referral in the app. If the only option was if they were in one of those red zones there, which are their kind of rideshare zones, Then if they were within service hours, they would get an on-demand proposal. Either way, they'd be able to kind of book it. And this is a fleet of 33 vehicles that are kind of operating both the first mile and a zonal service in suburban Detroit. Pickup by Cap Metro is kind of another great example. So this is the northern area, northern suburbs of Austin. In 2017, they had a dial-a-ride service they wanted to tech enable. And so they wanted to run their own pilot. So they started a 1-year pilot, used on demand, found that they were actually able to increase ride requests and overall ridership by 4x by introducing technology enablement into the booking process. And then they took all the data from that 1 year of the pilot, went back to their community and said, where else do you want this type of flexible transit? What kind of context? And they actually heard from very different types of communities, from high-income suburban areas to lower-income, more kind of urban adjacent, as well as lower-income rural areas. And as you can see here from the map, they've now, fast forward 5 years, they now have expanded to kind of 8 different zones that are all doing on-demand in slightly different ways. And actually, there are multiple different operators that the agency contracts out to that operate on the same platform for booking and for routing. Wanted to kind of provide some local examples too. And so this is an example from Jersey City. So kind of right in the shadow, many of you maybe have driven through or know it. It can get very, actually, fairly suburban toward the southern end of it, and was completely reliant on New Jersey transit routes that ended up getting cut because of budgetary reasons. And so the city kind of looked at it and said, okay, now we have these transit deserts in the north and south. What's the best way for us to fill this gap? Should we start our own fixed route? Should we subsidize or give payment vouchers to taxis or Ubers and Lyfts? Should we start our own private shuttles? And what they kind of aligned on was the use of microtransit in many ways because it was the most cost-effective and flexible. And so they designed a zone where, in the central zone here, is a high-capacity corridor and has a high-functioning fixed route system going in and out of New York City. They didn't want to cannibalize that, so they only made rides possible from outer to central and vice versa. You can also go outer to outer, and they have a fare payment system where it's basically $2 a ride and 50 cents for every mile beyond that. Given the geography of the city, you're never paying more than $5 to get around. And what they found is that this is a kind of heat map of the requests as well as rides that were delivered. The natural kind of trip generators ended up being these intermodal hubs, which is kind of no surprise. So 60% of the trips in the service are connecting to other kind of regional fixed transit, and then the other 40% are serving areas that didn't have any fixed route option because it was cut previously. And you look at the rider surveys, which is kind of like another tool that you can now do because you have an app-based technology and get this feedback from your community. And over 50% of the riders had a household income less than 50K, and the vast majority of them were using it for commuting, as well as what we kind of call critical errands. Have to go get food for your kid, have to go to the drugstore to get medicine. May have to pick up your kid from daycare or get access to health care. Those are the reasons that the riders were using it. And we started this at what may have been like the worst time in history, at least the last 100 years, to start an on-demand service or just a public transit service in general in March of 2020, right when everyone went to ground. And so we actually saw that because this was serving essential service workers, there's been pretty explosive growth in ridership. So now we're helping the city do around 2,000 rides per day. And it's become a critical part of the transit infrastructure in the city. Obviously a little bit of a bigger example, but even pared down to like a 4-fleet size with a city that's a little bit less in population, there's a mode here that's, I think, potentially of real interest, especially for you as you think through the advantages of parking versus mobility. And that's also why I wanted to bring up this case study. So this is actually from Memphis, and originally, here, the challenge was that the Downtown Memphis Commission wanted to look at where should they build their next parking garage. They did a study, and what they found was we don't need to necessarily build a new one. We actually have to kind of better connect the ones that do exist. And so they took that fact and kind of worked together with the Memphis Medical District Collaborative, which is kind of a business improvement district for the medical campus that exists there. And what they realized is that the fixed route that they were running for employees and students to get to the medical campus wasn't well utilized. And so there's two groups of riders. And then the Memphis Area Transit Agency had lower income populations in New Chicago, as well as other northern parts of the city, where they wanted to get job access down to where all the trips were, all the employers were in the southern part of the city. So they launched Groove On Demand. It's been a very successful service for them. They're now close to actually 200 trips per day. And have now elected to, using the data that they saw where they got requests from areas that weren't served, decided to actually switch the boundaries of where they wanted to end up providing on demand and switched it to areas that were further kind of southeast and north, kind of an example of how you bring that data back into the planning environment and continue to optimize the service. And then of course locally here, we're very proud to be involved with Suffolk County Transit On Demand. So this is an instance where it's Via's technology matched with Hampton Jitney in terms of the drivers, and these are actually paratransit cutaway vehicles that are being used. And the impetus for this was that the Route 10A that used to run from up through North Haven and in Southampton was cut, and so they wanted to find a replacement that was more flexible to kind of fill that gap. They settled on the use of microtransit, and there's a three vehicle service right now that's running there, doing almost 200 rides weekly, which is more than kind of the max seasonal volume we saw with the previous fixed route. They're doing about 40 rides per day, and I very much encourage anyone that's interested to kind of go out there and give it a spin. You just need to go to the LIRR station there, and you can download the app and actually use it yourself. And then the last thing I want to note is that, in terms of looking to the future with microtransit, it's really kind of vehicle agnostic. So it could be an autonomous vehicle, it could be an electric vehicle of any sort, a cutaway size or a large bus. This is an example from Arlington, Texas, where if you see this kind of small subzone here around the UTA campus, it's the University of Texas at Arlington. This is a partnership between May Mobility, the university, the city, and VIA. So this is a fully functional, 100% autonomous subzone working within the public transit system within Arlington, Texas. It's a one-year pilot, and over the first 6 months, there's already been 20,000 shared on-demand AV rides that have been delivered as a result of the pilot. And this is an instance where we're even seeing like new technologies being used with dynamic dispatch and routing, and of course kind of supplementing the regional transit picture. So I know there's a lot of information, but it was really excited to be able to come here and talk to you about it today, and I'd love to take kind of any questions you have. Yes? Yeah.
Eric, what do you find, maybe this is like it'll be 2 answers, pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, but in general, what percentage of the time is there more than one rider on a microtransit vehicle?
Yeah, great question.
Fixed route is nearly 100. Paratransit maybe is 20%.
Right. Yeah, great question, and I'll repeat it per Kevin. So the question was, how often is there actually shared rides when the service is operational, especially taking in the pandemic? So I'll use kind of Jersey City as an example. Early on in the pandemic, kind of saw the same bump down. So I think it was around 30 to 50%, but now 70% of the rides that are delivered as part of the service are shared. And I think that's fairly, it's not across the board. I have to look what our kind of like 500 Service Plus average is, but we certainly aim to have utilizations for on-demand, not necessarily kind of demand response, because that's a wider area and it's pre-booked. Certainly up where, as close to 3 or 4 as we can on average, knowing that there will be kind of peaks during commute times, or and during off peaks, maybe a little bit lower. So I'd say 70%. Yeah. Yep.
Okay, I'm a little confused.
No problem.
2 questions.
Okay.
One, what the similarity between this and Uber Pool?
Mm-hmm.
Isn't that just I guess you are not delivering door to door, or is that the difference? Or?
Yeah, no, great question. So what's the difference between on-demand public transit and Uber Pool? So Uber Pool or Lyft Line, those are instances in which if there is a driver that wants to sign on to the platform that's serving and has said that they will do group rides, you can, as a rider, choose, I'll take, I think now for Uber it's about $1, which is not much, off of my Uber fare to get pooled with other riders that might be going in the same direction. That's kind of like a direct-to-consumer setting, and the Uber and Lyft algorithms they weren't built as ride sharing they weren't built as ride hailing for ride sharing. So the paths they're taking are kind of can be wildly divergent in terms of the detours they choose to take and the ETAs they'll give you. The difference between that and what we're describing here is that this is an instance where you're kind of taking the ability to in a technologically enabled way, hail a ride and matching that with a shared ride that's delivered as part of a public transit service. So this was called like Groove on Demand, Suffolk Transit on Demand. These are agencies and cities that are using on-demand technology within their own public transit brand, and most importantly with dedicated fleet. So given the way you've designed the service, that you can always get a ride within 20 minutes on average.
My next question is this good for use in big cities, but as well as small facilities?
Actually, I mean, it depends on the use case. It can be like more for evening, but it's actually most ideally set for more like sparsely populated, dense, less dense populated areas.
Okay.
Yeah.
I guess can you walk me through the user experience, because I'm not getting. I download an app.
Yeah.
I have payment in the app.
Mm-hmm. You can here, so what it would be like is like, I'm here, I'd like to go to Port Jefferson rail station. So I would take out my phone and download, let's say Suffolk Transit On Demand started a on-demand service that served the kind of Port Jefferson, SUNY Stony Brook, and the rail station. I would indicate, I know that it's an on-demand service, so I would go into Suffolk Transit On Demand for this zone, and I would put my origin, put my destination, and then I would get a trip proposal that said, this driver or this vehicle can be there in 15 minutes to pick you up, and you can arrive to Port Jefferson rail station in 30 minutes. Do you want that trip?
I'll pick you up where?
Wherever I drop my PIN or enter an address.
Because you mentioned something about walking to football field. That's not, you don't have to go to an actual.
Depending on where other riders are and where the vehicle is, you might have a different length of walk. So yes, I might need to walk like a couple blocks from here to pick up my ride, or it might pick me up right here, depending on if there's 2 of us that maybe are going to the rail station at the same time, for example. So it's a little bit variable, but that's kind of, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
So what's the benefit of using this versus Uber or Lyft? That's probably the question that everybody has on their mind. Like, how do you market this as a benefited service as opposed to Uber or Lyft? Like, why take your service to the train station as opposed to just calling Uber and taking an Uber to the train station?
Yeah.
Like, what's the benefit for us as a consumer?
Sure. So as a rider, so this is offered in a public transit setting. So the fares you're paying on microtransit are the same as you'd be paying for fixed rate. Right, so it's going to be a cheaper fare because it's in the public transit subsidy model. In addition to that, it's kind of locally branded, and it's a dedicated fleet, which means that there will be a ride that's available, as opposed to being kind of subject to whether an Uber or Lyft driver signs on, and it's going to be in a shared ride setting, so it's a more kind of sustainable mode to be using and more efficient. And oh, sorry, just one follow-up. Also, if it's offered within the public transit setting, it's actually driving ridership to the fixed routes that are connecting. So, for example, if like a student wanted to get down to the mall, they took microtransit to a Suffolk Transit fixed route that was going to the mall. They could take that instead of having to try and find someone or pay a lot for an Uber, and they could do it, during hours maybe or even the weekend, for example. But that's kind of the benefit. John,
It's a regulated service too. So
Yeah.
Public transit is highly regulated by local, state, federal regulation, including drug and alcohol testing, random testing. And I'm a Uber user, and my kids are Uber users. But there's problems with the Uber system that hopefully we work out over time. By the way, as Uber becomes regulated, it will cost the same as microtransit. But right now, there's a chance if you take Uber that you're going to get punched in the face as a driver. That's happened, not to me personally, but we've never had, I'm going to change myself. I'm a bar driver, so this is really we could all sign up as Uber drivers for this meeting today. It takes like 6 weeks to become a training driver. So it's a different level of safety.
And that's the same process for you, like you have to go through the city's process to be a driver?
so we're just providing the software for, normally how we partner is whether it's a university or a municipality like a city or county or an agency, they have vehicles and drivers, and they'd like to use software to turn those into an on-demand network. And so through a rider app, a driver app, and an admin console, they can have that kind of dynamic and dispatch routing that those vehicles and drivers can do for their riders.
Okay, so you don't have to provide the actual driver.
No.
Yeah, and ideally you're not using microtransit on the side of your house.
Sure.
It's supposed to connect to. Yeah, so there's still a place, Uber still actually gets into this model.
Yeah.
Takes over, when you're looking for something that's not as daily, it costs less. We're willing to share a ride.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, it's a different type of ride and market for it that you want for it's almost like a taxi market, which is not the same as a public transit market. This is kind of a space between a taxi and a fixed route that public transit can't provide. Yeah.
Do the schedules generally stay the same as, so like you have regular transit schedule stuff, this. When I do my requests, is it just based on that particular schedule, or is it based on whatever competency or
Yeah, normally there are service hours around which on-demand is available. And usually, it depends on what kind of use case you're serving. Like if it's just a commuter service, for example, it might just be 6 hours in the morning, 6 hours in the evening around certain times, or it could be just an off-peak service. Usually it's around 10 to 12 hours because having it as a reliable choice for riders is a great way to drive adoption and rider growth too. Yeah.
What about an on-demand service, and my friend wants to hop on sort of last night, I'll jump in there with you. Is there another method of payment that goes out the app?
Yeah, so in that case, you would just, you can accept, we can accept cash, but I mean, you could just basically mark that you have 2 people that you want to bring with you on the trip, and they'd be able to ride, and you'd pay for them. So they have Venmo, they'd get you back.
So this is a room full of parking and transportation professionals, and there's tons of questions coming from this group. How do you educate the public? And who's subsidizing that effort? What does that look like?
It's certainly coming from events like this and kind of education about this as a mode. Sorry, I haven't been repeating the questions.
That's fine.
How do we,
How do municipalities roll out when they?
how do they do this? Yeah, so it's an interesting question because some cities feel like they want to do this themselves. other agencies want to do it in places that benefit cities. It really is kind of driven by whether, you know, what entity wants to go about doing it and for what reason. You know, the way we've kind of tried to educate is been to many of the transit conferences. And I have to admit, this is one more parking focused event that I was really excited to come participate in, because it's in many ways the flip side of transit, because demand for parking is a whole other kind of beast that kind of is dictated by where people can move and why. So I think taking place in these types of forums, but you know, certainly our website too, but there's starting to be more microtransit services globally, not just from us, but from other technology providers too, that municipalities and agencies are starting themselves. Yeah?
What are the regulatory, or rather, what are the legislative and policy considerations when thinking about advocacy?
What sort of advocacy?
So let's say we have a state senator who is, you know, putting forth a bill. What might VIA be thinking about from a legislative standpoint?
Got it. So the question was, what can be done from a legislative or kind of regulatory standpoint, from the standpoint of an advocate? So one thing to note is that, you know, normally with transit agencies, there is you know, across different states, there's forms of kind of formula reimbursement. That is possible with microtransit, and obviously it already is with paratransit. So that's something to take into account, just as kind of like a funding sustainable model. What states like New York and California and Vermont actually have done is also provided discretionary innovative mobility grants to help kind of incubate these types of services more to get them going. And that's been very effective. So actually the New York State Energy Research Development Agency just had a Clean Transportation Prize that they put out for 3 different challenges. And we partnered with 2 different, with Ulster County and Westchester County respectively, to try and launch electrified microtransit in zones in those counties as part of the Clean Transportation Prize. That's another example of the type of kind of like innovative funding that the state has brought to kind of speed adoption.
Got it. And then tangentially, there might be an opportunity for advocacy in relation to utility for electric fleets in particular. Yeah. You know, I mean, it's vehicle agnostic, right? So, you know, one of the interesting things is that in terms of electric vehicles, the first ones that are becoming available because of the supply chain are, you know, 40-foot buses and cutaways. The last one that will actually be kind of fully electric and introduced will be kind of 6-passenger minivans or smaller. And so that's kind of coming down, but traditionally we've seen, you know, anything from a cutaway on down as something that can be used for dynamic dispatch and routing. So we'll probably see more electrification as a result of that, but certainly opportunities there. Yep.
Eric, maybe a tough question to answer. What is the most popular type of vehicle that you use for microtransit? Car, 6-passenger vans, cutaways?
The most popular and kind of the most flexible is like a 6-passenger minivan, or up maybe to like a Ford Transit. Also, they're not really here in the US, but in Europe, certain Mercedes vans that carry up to like 10, 12 passengers. Those are the kind of best form factor for capacity and the ability to still be navigable and kind of agile enough as a vehicle and be able to dynamically route.
The important difference between Uber and this. Uber is limited to 5 passengers. Or CDL, I'm not sure exactly how they draw that line. But once you get to 6 passengers, you need a commercial driver's license.
Yep.
And Uber will take the extra passenger if they've got Suburban or so they will be limited to Uber ride share.
Yeah, that's right. And we can actually go up to, in this case, the cutaways for Suffolk County that are using it, and I think you can get up to about 20, 23, 25.
What's a cutaway?
A cutaway is like a
like minibus. I'm gonna, John, I might get in trouble with John here the way I'm describing this, but a cutaway is like, you know, basically half of a long 40-foot bus that you might see.
They're known as airport shuttles.
Yeah. Yeah.
Why do they call it? Because it's half, they cut it in half.
But you buy the chassis is made by, let's say, Ford or General Motors, and the chassis manufacturer buys the engine, the seat, and the steering wheel, and then they take metal and they fabricate this body.
So it's not a convertible.
No. No. Yeah. Only in Southern, yeah. Only in Southern California probably is there all convertible microtransit. Yes.
Do people using rails versus people coming off a bus use the service equally? And demographically, how would you typically characterize the rail? I know it's different from market to market.
Yeah, so the question was, are rail users versus kind of bus users using this? And then second question was, demographically, how would you characterize ridership? So it really depends on how the agency or city designs it. So for example, Brightline, which is a rail provider in, it's actually a public-private partnership rail in all through Florida. They have used microtransit to bring people to and from each of the rail stations. And so in that case, it's a very different demographic. And I'd say it's kind of spread equally, like across all the services that we are a technology partner to. Inevitably, we kind of see what we did in Jersey City, where probably over half of those trips are to transit centers. And if there's rail available, then it kind of makes natural sense that it would go there. But oftentimes, if it's not, then it's to a central bus station. And then the other part of your question, I do think that with this type of model, and this is a real benefit, I think, for society, there's kind of this dichotomy between transit dependent and transit choice that's kind of ruled the roost in transit planning circles. And that doesn't have to be the case, because now you're seeing different kinds of expectations as a rider. They want to be able to book it, and they also want to do something that's sustainable. And so there is less of a distinction between those that are, certainly we have, services that serve, transit-dependent populations, and it's making a huge impact for them in terms of their mobility. But equally so, there are places where now it's an option. You're kind of seeing this latent demand from a demographic that maybe didn't want to take an Uber or Lyft, but are happy to use the public transit system to go from A to B in the community and do so more sustainably. Yeah.
When you work as a city, do you provide any kind of strategy to help them to increase ridership? Do you work with any other local restaurants to provide a discount if you drive them to a certain destination?
Yeah, so the question was, do we work with our partners to help increase ridership during the course of and the answer is definitely yes. So the way that we kind of structure how we work as a microtransit partner is to have a dedicated partner success manager. And so what I was speaking to in terms of the data that's being used to inform your service, it's all cloud-based, so you would basically kind of log on and see, oh, my utilization is 2.9, why is it 4? And you could have a conversation around, well, maybe it's because if you increase the amount of time or distance that someone might need to walk to get to the pickup marginally, you could actually drive up utilization because there'd be more passenger aggregation. That type of conversation would be something that you would have with your kind of partner success manager or your technology provider if they're doing their job right. And it would also be something that you could do yourself with data that's available to you in a cloud-based fashion, where you log on to a desktop and you can see this is the health of my service, these are the areas, these are the tools I have to kind of deal with that. Okay. Thank you very much.